Each year, Microsoft Research hosts hundreds of influential speakers from around the world, including leading scientists, renowned experts in technology, book authors, and leading academics, and makes videos of these lectures freely available.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. My name is Kim Ricketts, and I manage the Microsoft Research Visiting Speaker Series. And today we are thrilled to have Roderick Lee here to talk to us. But to do a great introduction of Roderick, I want to introduce Jonathan Gruden of Microsoft.
Thank you, Kim. I met Roderick Lee in February at the Human-Computer Interaction Consortium meeting in Colorado. It's a small, intense conference that brings together faculty and students in human-computer interaction. And it starts off, everybody gives a brief description of what they're doing. And Roderick described the project that he was embarking on then, that he'll be talking about now. And it was a very interesting project. And afterwards, I asked him whether he was faculty member at Penn State University or a student at Penn State University, and he said both, because he is an instructor in the information systems group in the School of Business at Penn State University Harrisburg, and he's also a graduate student at Penn State University and State College in the School of Information Science and Technology, where he's working with one of the best-known groups in the human-computer interaction field, and I'll let him describe the work that he described there. He's won a number of awards in his career, which are mentioned in the bio that was distributed with the abstract to his talk. So, thank you. Very pleased that he's come here to give this talk. He's mentioned that he's a single father. He's left his two kids there to almost fend for themselves while he comes here to give us this talk. So thank you, Roderick.
Oh, boy. Thank you all much. And for an icebreaker, I'm supposed to imagine that you're members of the local polar bear club, and it's about 10 degrees outside and you're all nude. But at any rate, as Jonathan just said, the topic that I want to talk about today is pretty much about understanding group effectiveness in a newly formed online community. And it's a topic that I've been working on now for the past 3 years or so. I'm working with Jack Carroll in the College of Information Sciences and Technology at Penn State, who's my dissertation chair. His wife, you may all know, Mary Beth Rawson. Another interesting fellow that I'm working with is Gerald Sussman, who is the Senior Research Dean in the Smeal College of Business at Penn State Harrisburg, and I'm actually using the action research model that was developed by Sussman and Everett back in 1978. Someone else you might be familiar with is Brian Smith, who came to Penn State from MIT, Craig Gannot, who came from Virginia Tech to Penn State, who actually developed the software that the group is using. And then there's Joe Tyler, who's at Penn State University, who graduated from Columbia, but her major focus on working with this group is on the storytelling aspect of it. So basically what I'll do is just go through this outline in detail here as I give the talk. So what Putnam suggested was there's been a decline in social capital among voluntary association. But other researchers have come and said, well, the people are not volunteering with these place-based organizations, but this activity is now online. There was a study that came out in 2001 by Pew Internet Research and Life Group suggested that over 90 million users have participated in online groups. Some more research that came out was basically from Amy Jo Kim that talked about online communities. In her book, she looked at designing online communities. And Vinger and Associates pretty much talk about communities of practice, and now they've extended that conversation to actually talk about distributed community of practice, which are communities in practice that can't meet physically place all the time, but that some of their interaction is over the web. So the distinction that they make between these online communities and communities of practice is that in the latter, what you see is they focus on knowledge sharing and learning, but they also focus on a passion with respect to the topic. So as a whole, what we realize is that there's a lot of challenges in this particular domain, namely that a lot of online communities fail. Second, you have this aspect of supporting these communities across time and space because a lot of them are remote. And next, what you have is understanding the developmental trajectories of communities as well. Now, Amy Jo Kim has her particular perspective on designing communities of practice. Wenger and Associates also have a model of development for communities of practice, but really there's no theoretical base to that model. It's pretty much developed just for practitioners to understand what developmental trajectories that communities of practice go through as they evolve. So it leads to an important question, and that is, why do some online communities in certain situations outperform others, or why are some more productive than others? So basically what I decided to do was take a look at this from a body of research that's been around for over 5 decades, and that's the literature on groups and teams, where it looks at group effectiveness. And if group effectiveness has been this stable construct for over 50 or so years now, then why can't we use group effectiveness as a lens to analyze online communities as well? But when you look at the literature on groups and teams, you find out that there are 2 theoretical explanations as to what makes groups effective. One, they talk about group development and performance. The other one, they talk about social networks and performance. So you have multiple perspectives on this group effectiveness, leads one to suggest, well, are they complementary or not, are they not complementary? So group effectiveness defined, group effectiveness basically is this 2-part construct, where the first one you look at is productivity. And productivity is defined as the acceptability of outputs by members in the group and the stakeholders in the external community, whereas viability concerns the willingness and the participation of members over a sustained period of time. So that's pretty much looking at whether or not the members of the group are going to be willing to work together as a group in the future. So this first one you have this group development paradigm. And so in 1965, what Tuckman came out with was this stage model of group development. And so pretty much what Tuckman suggested is that groups go through this storming, norming, performing, and transforming. But basically what scholars have done is that they've looked at groups as these static entities. They've not looked at how groups evolve over time. But basically groups are just like people. They evolve, they mature, and they develop over time. So this particular relationship has been empirically validated for over 4 decades now. In this particular class of research, what you find is 2 perspectives, where one, they look at linear models of group development, and in the other perspective, they look at nonlinear models of group development. Again, in the linear model of group development, you look at classic stage models, and in the nonlinear, what people tend to look at is the punctuated equilibrium model that was developed by Connie Gersick and Associates. So in my research, what I've done is I've developed this coding scheme so that I can analyze the development of the group over time and sort of get an understanding of what particular model of development this group is following. So first you have the stage model, where you have the forming, storming, norming, and transforming. And these are behaviors that groups exhibit during these particular stages of group development, where the first one is pretty much where they're forming. And in this particular stage, the task is new, the group members are new, basically no leader has emerged, and they're trying to get to know each other, and they're trying to get a good understanding of what the actual task is. There's differences in opinions and in ideas, which leads to conflict. So the second stage, storming, is characterized by conflict. The third stage, norming, is characterized by the development of cohesion. And the fourth stage, performing, is characterized by increased task activity among the group members as well as learning. So basically what I intend to do, or what I will do, is go through this model and check off each one of these particular behaviors that the groups exhibit during certain points of time. Okay, the second model is the punctuated equilibrium model. And what's different about the punctuated equilibrium model is that it pretty much looks at external triggers that prompt change within the group. And this change is generally revolutionary and deep change. So it doesn't look at stages of group development. What it looks at is phases. So you have the beginning phase to the midpoint, and then you have the midpoint to the end of the group's task. So with this beginning task here, you have quick formation of the group. So it's typically a group that has worked together before, has some sort of idea of what the task is. They come together and they go through this quick formation, and they have sort of like this stable equilibrium period to where really they're just coasting along. There's not a high increase in activity, and there's not a certain high level of performance that the groups exhibit. But what they do at the midpoint is that they realize that there's an impending deadline, and that if they don't reevaluate their action strategies, then they're not going to be able to complete the task up to the standard that they've set for themselves. And so you see at the midpoint this huge spike in activity that sort of levels off until the end of the task. And finally, what some scholars have suggested is that the stage model pretty much looks at these developmental trajectories where you have this linear development where you have one stage that follows another one and you can't skip stages. Punctuated equilibrium, external, where you look at temporal pacing and time awareness. Arrow, McGrath, and Associates, they pretty much identified the groups as complex systems as a means to looking at groups that are in natural context that pretty much develop and change based on internal as well as external factors. So realizing that phase and stage models are problematic, they pretty much like to focus on modes where you have the formation, operation, and metamorphosis. Now, in this particular group that I'm working in right now, it's not an online community, but what we envision is that at some point it would become an online community or an online community of practice. So in the formation mode, clarifies group boundaries, there's a certain level of excitement, and they establish a coordination network. In the operations mode, which can occur simultaneously with the formation mode, is where they go through and they modify this coordination network. There's attentional to social and emotional needs. And at the last one, metamorphosis, where the group disbands or they transform into a completely different type of entity. And again, the way it's coded right now is that I can go through and I can tick off each one of these behaviors that the group exhibits, calculate a percentage of which, but these behaviors at each, the group pretty much exhibits in each one of these models, and determine which model the group follows. And if the group doesn't follow each model to a level of 70%, then that would lead one to suggest that this group didn't follow either one of those models of development. So that's pretty much the group development paradigm. Now the network paradigm, similar to the group development paradigm, has been around for quite some time now, and it started out in the 1950s with studies on communication nets. So people like Bales, Bevalis, Shaw, and a lot of others, what they looked at was examining the effect of certain communication nets on performance. So again, it's been around for over 5 decades right now. And what scholars have realized over the years is that these networks are important conduits for the flow of information, advice, trust, social support, etc. Things that are pretty much talked about implicitly in group development, but not explicitly discussed. You also have these bonding versus bridging perspectives, leading the scholars to come up with competing predictions about group performance, where you have some people that look at these closed networks and suggest that groups with closed networks exhibit high levels of performance, where you have other researchers who look at these structural wholes, suggest that groups with structural wholes have high level of performance. And so instead of combining these two approaches, they basically look at them as competing entities. Until recently, some scholars such as O and some of the others, they come up with this optimal configuration perspective, where they realize that group effectiveness is a function of both forms of social capital. On the flip side, you have Granover's strong versus weak tie proposition as well. So some of the deficiencies in these approaches, what we do realize is that these approaches have not been integrated into the same study except for on one occasion in 1997 where Walker et al. Examined the development of a industry group. And they looked at group development, they looked at network structure, and what they found out was that in the early stages of group development, that the group relied on bridging social capital because the task was more informational. But as the group began to perform the group tasks and began to work on the projects, they relied a lot on this bonding social capital because it required the group to come together and be at a level to where they can combine this tacit knowledge that the members of the group shared. Very few studies have empirically examined competing models of development within the same study. There have been only a handful, and more recently, Alan Dennis at Indiana University in the School of Business is embarking on a study where they're studying 6 different groups, and they're studying this group from the lens of 2 development models. That's the stage model and the punctuated equilibrium model. Other deficiencies in this research is that in the research design, most of the group development and most of the communication net research was conducted in the laboratory settings with ad hoc groups who came together for these short periods of time to perform a task that was defined by the researcher. These tasks normally last 10-15 minutes, or it could last an hour. So you really didn't get a good chance to see the group activities unfold over time. So a lot of variables you couldn't really explore in those particular studies. Now, back in 1975 was when Hackman developed what was probably one of the first comprehensive models of group effectiveness. And in that 1975 article and in articles afterwards, scholars have been continually calling for an action research approach to study these type of groups so that a researcher could understand what prompt change and development within the group and be able to sort of characterize the group as a more richer picture. So what I intend to do in my study and what I've done so far is I've integrated the literature on group development, social networks, and group effectiveness to come up with a hybrid model of what I call long-term group effectiveness, because this particular group I'm going to study for a year, and in my opinion, that's long-term. That's about as long-term as you can get. Now, what's interesting and what has been overlooked until this point is that when you look at group performance and you look at network performance and you look at group effectiveness, what all of these studies talk about implicitly is they talk about group processes, where in group development they talk about cohesion, they talk about conflict, they talk about communication. In network, they talk about networks leading to greater information sharing among participants. They talk about bonding social capital leading to cohesion and solidarity. They also talk about, in each one of these paradigms, they talk about norms and values. For example, in the group development paradigm, in the performing stage or the norming stage, they talk about the groups pretty much coming together and agreeing on a specific set of norms and values to guide the behavior of the group. But they don't talk about the antecedents of those particular values and norms. In the network performance paradigm, they pretty much talk about these network ties as being conduits for the transmission of these values and norms within the group. In group effectiveness, they pretty much also talk about the group processes as being summary indicators of group effectiveness. So what I'm looking at is social capital as being the key construct that integrates these 3 streams of research into a coherent whole. So some of the commonalities, again, I talked about was these group processes, and pretty much Kozlowski and Associates indicated that these group processes were summary indicators of performance, and norms and values have been talked about for quite some time now, starting with McGrath and a whole host of other researchers. Now, one of the interesting things that happened in 2002 was Adler and Kwan published a study on social capital prospects for a new construct or a new concept, and what they did was they deconstructed the concept of social capital. So pretty much in their study, what they suggested scholars look at is the structure of the network, the tie content as well as whether or not it's internal or external. So in terms of the structure of the network, you're looking at the bonding and bridging social capital, as well as instrumental and expressive ties. Now these instrumental ties are pathways for the flow of information and task-related advice, and that's been empirically validated to have a strong association with performance. But when you look at these expressive ties are pathways for emotional and social support. Now, if you're working with a group, there's going to be some things that happen in the group, some discussions that take place, some reaching out, some assistance and helping that doesn't have a lot to do with the task, but it could be that you're having a bad day, you might have difficulty finding something, you might just need somebody to pat you on the back and just tell you what a great job you're doing or just carry on. What scholars have found out is that expressive ties have a strong association with viability. That has to do with the sustainability of the group, meaning that if you don't have this expressive tie network within a group, then the group could pretty much just burn itself out, lose focus, or people just might not want to continue working with the group. Now, this pretty much looks like a complicated picture of what I call long-term group effectiveness. So in the past, the literature on group effectiveness has been separated into two strands of research where you have the group development and you have the network performance relationship. So I'll start over here on the end where you have productivity and viability as the defining constructs of group effectiveness. The processes that I'm looking at in my study are effective communication, the extent to which information is shared openly, freely, and timely among members in the group. You have cohesion. Pretty much I'm dealing specifically with task cohesion. That's pretty much the members' attraction to the group, liking of the group, attraction to the task as well. Conflict management has to do with the ability of the group to converge on conflicting perspectives, ideas, and opinion. Participation, looking more at online, offline participation, analyzing it by looking at social loafing in terms of process losses and process gains. And learning, what I'm doing differently about learning here is looking at learning in two different places. So over here, learning is looked at in terms of Argus and Schoen's notion of a single and double loop learning. So it's pretty much looking at how the group goes about the problem solving process. In some models of group effectiveness, they explicitly include problem solving as a process. But what I intentionally did here was put learning here so I can analyze it from this lens of single and double loop learning to identify which type of problem solving mode the group was in. So at the group level, the variables I'm looking at in terms of social capital is network density, network centrality, and network balance, which network balance is a function of reciprocity and transitivity. Group structure, norm similarity, value congruity, division of labor, and then these individual level constructs is where learning is also captured. So it's looking at the skills, knowledge, and abilities of each individual member of the group. And basically, the study is longitudinal in examining this particular behavior over time. Now, in terms of group development, again, there's three different theories of group development that the group is being analyzed from, and there's a certain level of maturity at each stage of the data collection process. Now, what's different about this model also is there's a feedback loop. So one of the things that's happened now that since I've collected the first round of data, I'm going to go back to the primary stakeholder next week and I'm going to present my summary findings. And this model is going to be used to point out constraints and opportunities within the group. I've also given her a copy of Wenger's book on cultivating communities of practice, so she can then take the information that I give her and go about working with the group in a different manner or point out some inconsistencies with group behavior that might be hindering performance or point out those particular factors that have led to enhanced performance. Research method is quite different with this group as I'm using an action research methodology, and again this action research model was developed by Sussman and Everett. So Actually, I went through development of the client system infrastructure by working with the primary stakeholder and identifying who the key players in the group are going to be. And basically, that was developed by looking at the primary stakeholder and getting a good understanding of who her egocentric network was. And those are the key players that I'm studying in this particular study. So in the first phase here is diagnosing and identifying the problem. Mostly what's been used in action research is use scenarios, use storytelling to basically diagnose and identify the problem. What's different about this particular study is that I'm using social network analysis as a tool to analyze the problem, to point out some deficiencies within the structure of the network. So after I point out these, we go into the action planning, where I sit down with the lead participant after she's read the book, and we decide which course of action we're going to take next. So in November, what we have planned is a kickoff meeting where she'll come in and she'll present what steps the group needs to take in order to be in a position to submit 3 more applications to the National Park Service, and I'll talk about that a little bit shortly. They'll be going through action taking, where they'll be selecting a course of action, evaluating learning, and specifying learning. And so what I intend to do with this action research model is go through at least two cycles in order to show that this model was effective for this particular group. So putting this all into context, so I talked about the theory, I talked about the research method, and I know some of you are saying now, well, where's the group? Who are we working with? Who are the participants? Well, first of all, what I'll say is what motivated this group to actually form was based upon a congressional mandate. And in 1998, Congress passed the Underground Railroad Network to Freedom Act. And what Congress recognized was that there was a lot of racial tension here in the United States, and that the Underground Railroad was a struggle among blacks and whites for equality and freedom. So this might be a good topic for the nation as a whole to begin to explore, to create some sort of racial harmony. Within that directive, what Public Law 105-203 established the National Underground Railroad Network to Freedom Act, to Freedom Program, and basically that's in the National Park Service, and part of that program is to increase collaboration and communication among interested parties across the nation who are involved in researching underground railroad sites. So bringing it home to Pennsylvania, we know that Pennsylvania was a pivotal state in the Underground Railroad, and it's pretty much characterized in William Steele's book, The Underground Railroad. In William Steele's book, he pretty much identified 744 unique slave cases that he personally interviewed on their journey to freedom. But when you look at Pennsylvania's representation on the Underground Railroad Network to Freedom, as of May 2006, they only had 8 sites listed on the Network to Freedom database. Now that number has subsequently increased in September to 12. But the group that I'm working with is here in Adams County, and you notice in May that Adams County had no representation whatsoever. The only thing Adams County was known for was Gettysburg, the Battle of Gettysburg, which the Civil War occurred because of some of the slavery issues, and people thought it was kind of ironic that we celebrate Gettysburg for the battle, but we don't celebrate it for the other aspects of this Civil War that they were involved in. So I'm happy to say that this number has been increased from 8 to 12 now. They now have 12 sites in Pennsylvania that are on the Network to Freedom database, but it leaves just these few counties in the southeast that are actively participating in this program, but you have this whole landscape out there of no one doing anything. And so at the southern tip of Pennsylvania, you have Maryland, and I think Maryland has about 31 sites that they've documented. And on the western side, you have Ohio, which there's a lot of activity as well. And on the northern side, you have New York, which also has about 28 sites that they've identified. So it leads one to look at this picture, if I had all of these states on there, and say, well, what did they do? Did they travel around Pennsylvania? Or did they go under Pennsylvania? So it's a compelling picture, to say the least. So one of the things I found out also about working with this group, when you get to some of the northern counties, sometimes what they'll say is that, well, there was no Underground Railroad activity here, that nothing happened here. But people in the southeastern counties and people as far as Boston have reports of slaves who said they came from some of these particular counties that folks just pretty much say it just never happened. It never existed here. So at the beginning, this partnership was with the Pennsylvania Historical and Museum Commission, and I was working with the state coordinator of Underground Railroad. And according to the state coordinator of Underground Railroad history in Pennsylvania, that by federal law, every state has to have an Underground Railroad coordinator, and the Department of Education had to also be involved in order that Underground Railroad was represented in K through 12 education. So these particular people at the state work with the Bureau of Historic Places and the SHPO office that every state has, who's also responsible for documenting these sites. But again, with Pennsylvania's representation, you can suggest that that's probably not a good place for it to happen. But needless to say, that relationship dissolved primarily because we couldn't get a group of people at the state to play together that can go out in some of these counties and promote enough excitement to get people willing to participate, to get them actively involved in documenting this history to become a part of the program. And so this particular group that I'm working with now, I've been working with them since July, and they're from Adams County. They're an informal group of historians that have come together. They're geographically dispersed. The other part about it is that they're mostly volunteers. Only one person gets paid to work out of the 6 members that are in this group. And so some of the tasks that they have is that they have to go through and they have to identify what sites might have had a connection to the Underground Railroad. Then they have to go through researching, looking at primary and secondary documents, reading William Steele's book, and there's another book that was published out of Ohio that the National Park Service considers as a credible source. So in these particular books, if you see mention of this site, you can pretty much cut and paste and include those in your application. So after they go through researching the sites, they document them. Then the next process, they complete these applications to the National Park Service. Now, I should point out also that the National Park Service application is a 46-page set of instructions on how to complete the application. The application itself is 8 pages, and by the time you finish with this application, you wind up with about a 23 to 26-page document that has to follow a certain set of guidelines and instructions in terms of how you footnote, how you format, and how you cite. And the average historian is not going to be able to do that. So the participants, again, are all Caucasians except for one that's biracial. In terms of the secondary diversity characteristics, you see that there's 3 with high school and 3 with a college education, and you see that their religious affiliations are all different. The technology that we're using was developed by Craig Gannot in our lab, and it's BRIDGE technology, which stands for Basic Resources for Integrated Distributed Environments. And so one of the things that we've done with this group is we created a private workspace, and this private workspace is set up to where the groups can work with the advisory committee to determine which sites they're going to actively pursue nominating to the National Park Service. It also includes a shared workspace that has the applications as a template that people can get in, they can co-author. Now, one of the things we found difficult about this group in the first round of nominations is that they use Microsoft Word to complete the application because that's the format the National Park Service wants. But since the group is distributed, what they did was send these applications back and forth by email. What's problematic about that is sometimes you have versions that clash where one particular person might be implementing a change and somebody else might be going through a set of revisions at the same time. And when they email these documents back around for comments, you have these versions that clash. And sometimes you've got to go back and figure out, what you need to do to fix this. The other things it includes is a chat along with that co-authoring applications, discussion, and a calendar, and it also has a set of awareness tools. So some of the norms, values, and roles, and of course the lead stakeholder, she emphatically said, and when I said, what's your role? She said, I'm the queen, and if it wasn't for me, there would be no group. But in terms of values, you can see that each one of the participants that was involved, whereas John wasn't involved in the last round of applications, but they all pretty much talked about sharing information freely, and in terms of norms, they looked at trust, and they all talked about timely responses to communication. The goals and vision, what I wanted to do was look at how these goals and visions change over time and point out to the primary stakeholder that each particular person has a different goal for the group and a different vision for the group. So analysis of the social network variables at time 0, and what I used was UCRNet version 6. And so you can see from this networks of 6 people, in terms of people that you seek out for information and advice on task-related matters, you see that Helen reaches out to everyone. Robert only has 2 ties. Janet has 3 ties. Monica, John, and James, they only have 1 tie. And so that's basically a constraint in terms of the group performing as a collective whole, but it's an opportunity to use collaborative software to increase these connections among these members. When you look at the frequency of communication, you see that Janet and Helen indicated 7 here, whereas Robin and Helen have a frequency of 6, and James and John have a frequency of 7. So there's a lot of potential for increased frequency of communication as well. And so when you look at this sociogram, what you see is that Helen and Monica have a relationship to where each one of them ask each other for information and advice about the work task, whereas Helen asks John for information and advice, but John doesn't ask Helen for anything. Helen also asks James for information and advice, but James doesn't ask Helen for anything. You see a reciprocal relationship between Helen and Janet, as well as a reciprocal relationship between Helen and Robert, and between Robert and Janet. But you see Monica, who's the graduate student who's in Indiana, pretty much just isolated, and she's only connected to the group through Helen. So again, a lot of opportunity for an online collaborative environment. The expressive network, in terms of who you go to for emotional and social support, we see is pretty sparse as well, where Helen indicates that she goes to everyone in the group, but that's not reciprocated. People don't go out to Helen. And so you see John and Monica, they don't talk to anybody in the group about issues that they might need in terms of social and emotional support. Frequency is pretty low as well. And here again, you see the sociogram of the expressive network. In terms of the whole network variables, we see network density is 43.3%. So it's pretty, yes?
When you were in the numbers before, are those what, so is that like Helen, one axis is what Helen says, and then is that reciprocated at all by, so if Helen says she talks to Monica, was there a question of Monica as to whether or not Helen contacts?
Right. There's a question of Monica in terms of who she talked to in terms of information and advice. But I didn't ask Helen if she specifically talked to any of the other participants, other than if she went to this person for information and advice, and then I went to the next person and read the roster down to them as well. But I didn't ask them to verify that they had a relationship with the others. So network measures, in terms of the whole network density is 43.3%. So of the total possible connections among the group, only 43% are activated. In terms of Freeman's degree, where network centralization is 70%, meaning that this particular group of people, the activities are concentrated around 1 or 2 people, and that one person is Helen. In terms of Freeman's between this, the network centralization index is 58%, so it means that there's quite a lot of information and advice that's transmitted through go-betweens. That means I talk to you and then you talk to the other person. Reciprocity, you see that only 62.5% of the ties are reciprocated, meaning that if I go to you for information, advice, social, emotional support, then you also come to me. Transitivity, it looks at the triples in terms of if A likes B and C, then it's implied that C also likes B as well. And so of those ties that are transitive, there's only 47.6%. In terms of the expressive network, we see that that's quite low, primarily because there's not a lot of activity there. And so where does this take me now? So basically what I have is I have the first round of data collection done. The group has a deadline for January 15th. They also have a deadline for July the 15th. So shortly after the January 15th and July 15th deadlines, I go through and I conduct round 2 and round 3 of the data collection. So basically what I wanted to leave you with the message here was that social network analysis has important emancipatory potential to highlight constraints and opportunities within networks and also identify opportunities for information systems, in particular collaborative tools, to be able to fill some of those holes within those networks. Implications for research is that social capital and the network ties have important consequences for performance. Implications for practice are there's a greater need to not only incorporate more social psychological theory into information systems design, but there's an important need to look at social network analysis in order to inform the design of information systems to support communities and groups as well. So far, this particular project has been sponsored by the Pennsylvania Federation of Museum and Historical Organizations, received funding from the Fry Moore Endowment, which Jack Carroll is the Fry Moore Chair in the College of IST. I received in my faculty role an interdisciplinary grant from the Office of Research and Graduate Studies at Penn State Harrisburg. Also in a faculty role, I received a grant from the Office of the Vice President for Educational Equity at Penn State. And as a student, I received funding from the Africana Research Center for a dissertation award. So basically, as John has said, I wear multiple roles. I'm a student at Penn State main campus. I'm a faculty member at Penn State Harrisburg, and I'm a single parent to those 2 little kids right there. I still have one or two more minutes, and so what I wanted to do real quickly was just show you this system that we set up. So here's the homepage of the website. And so when I log into the workspace, and basically what we want to do is set this up as private. And one of the reasons why you see the goals and mission statement here is that now that the group have identified their individual responses to it, they can come together as a group and they can refine what their goals and their mission are. This might take a little bit. Okay, have we lost connection here? Okay, now we're in. Okay, in terms of the workspace, and again, that application, and I can show you briefly one of those applications. So here's a blank application. Okay, the blank application is pretty much set up where you have the National Park Service information up top. And then you have this long list of questions that the respondents have to complete, and the list goes on and on and on. That's the old site we had. Okay, I've gotten out of it, so I'll get back in. Okay, in this workspace, and so basically what the respondents do is they come here and they can create a workspace, and the workspace is basically each site that they plan on submitting an application for. And once they click on that particular workspace, it takes them into a collaborative environment where you have this bridge client loading up, and it's going to require them to input another user ID and password to get through this. So there's 2 steps that they have to go through in order to get into this environment. So hopefully that takes care of any sort of privacy concerns that the group has. And once they're in, okay, at the second round, Again, what the group would have wanted was a web version of Word that they can take that application and put it out there and just go through co-authoring that way. And so basically within one of these workspaces, the application is chunked into 4 separate sections where you have general information, you have information about the sites, facilities, education, and interpreted programs. So this is a template that they just go through and they can create one for each one of the applications that they're working on. And so when you click on general information, it pops up the questions with respect to general information, and there's about a 1 to 2 second delay, so 4 or 5 people can be working in this environment at the same time, and you're constantly information input on the screen. You have an awareness feature over here that shows the users that are logged on, and what you can do is let's say they have some sort of discrepancy about some information here. They can start an instantaneous chat that can be read by all the members that are logged in. So it's sort of like a group chat to help them resolve some of the issues that they might have with respect to completing the application. Another aspect of in terms of awareness is that you can hover over these and it's going to give you the date that there was any editing or change done. It's also going to tell you who made those particular edits as well. So that concludes my presentation here, and I really thank you all for inviting me out and taking the time out of your busy schedules to come in and listen to this talk. And if any of you have any information or any type of advice that you have for me, then you can send me an email at rlee@psu.edu.
Any time for questions?
It looks like you were focusing on small groups. How would you actually apply some of this? Some just like MySpace or YouTube, huge groups where they don't really talk well together, but they seem to thrive. But you've seen like classmates.com, they reached their peak and they sort of died off. I'm not sure if you can explain why these kinds of things happen at that level.
I'm not sure if I can explain why they happen, but one of the things that I want to do after I validate this instrument that I've developed is sort of explore it with larger groups. And so what I've done is I've developed this group effectiveness interview or survey guide, if you will, that operationalizes each one of those constructs, and I look to the leading scholars in that particular field and look at the measurements in terms of indices that they used in their research studies and tailor them to fit what would be an online community. So in particular for cohesion, I looked at Seashore, 1954, the Seashore Cohesion Index. And in terms of conflict, Jen at University of Pennsylvania and the Wharton School of Business developed an intergroup cohesion index. Yep.
So an online community can, as you stated, be as simple as emailing a document back and forth to everyone, to something as engaged as, say, a complete SharePoint portal server network. In your experience, how much does the technology used impact the effectiveness of groups compared to some of the other factors you described?
Well, I would say in this particular group I've been studying since August, one of the things that they did talk about was that they used a lot of email in the last round of applications, but the email was ineffective because it will be on one person's PC in terms of the email, and the document might be on a PC, whereas people go back and forth from work, go back and forth from vacation. But one of the things that I'm struggling with right now is looking at this collaborative environment and looking at the group processes and losses in terms of those group processes that I have, and sort of identifying a set of features that can be used to mitigate the process losses but enhance the process gains.
So, for example, in the expressive content type, will poor technology tools kill what would otherwise be a healthy, expressive, collaborative service? Or will it find a way regardless of the technology?
I would say so. I would suggest that what people tend to do is they would want some sort of way to initiate a private conversation with someone if it was off topic from the group discussion to where they were talking about a private matter and just reaching out for someone to provide that emotional and social support. So in that particular instance, what would probably be a good idea if there be some sort of backdoor mechanism in place where groups can communicate one-to-one in terms of one-to-many.
So if I'm hearing you correctly, having the wrong set of technology tools can really damage delivering expressive and instrumental content types effectively.
I would say certainly so.
Maybe you touched on this, but I wasn't quite sure. What, at the end of the time of your research, is there something you're looking at to define whether or not the group has had success?
Productivity in terms of the number of sites that they've identified, the number of applications that they submitted and were accepted, and also satisfaction among the group members themselves.
And I guess right there at the end, what as far as your research is more important, like how the group feels about the group having worked together, or the actual like acceptance of their.
Both. It looks at member satisfaction in terms of how the group feels about working with other members in the group. It looks at cohesion in terms of the attraction of the members to the group and to the group task. It also looks at the willingness of the groups to continue to working together with the group in the future. And in addition to that, looking at their perception on how they feel in terms of whether or not the technology being integrated into this environment helped or hindered their effectiveness.
The size of the questionnaire might skew that at all?
Oh, it is. I know it is.
I'm saying the people may get along well together in general terms, but it's like, oh my God, I'm not filling out 8 pages of forms.
Yeah. Well, one of the things I did differently about this questionnaire is that I didn't mail it to them and ask them to complete it. I used it in terms of an interview guide where I sat down with the participants face to face and I went through and asked the questions. And so if they gave an answer that I felt warranted more attention or more explanation, and then I would stop and ask them to elaborate more. So it leads to the question in terms of, I get what you're saying about, skewing their responses and their behavior, but in terms of action research, it might turn out that the questionnaire could have been the intervention itself.
You meant his questionnaire.
Yeah.
Yep.
Within this online community, have you found that conflicts have arisen between the members of the community, and how that conflict has been resolved? It seems that conflict is much easier to resolve face-to-face than it is kind of in an online community.
And one of the things I did was I asked specifically that question about during the last, and the specific question was, during the last rounds of submission to the National Park Service, describe any instances where conflict arose, and what did the group do, or what actions did they take to resolve the conflict? And overwhelmingly, all of them suggested that there was no conflict in the group, that they pretty much came together, they knew what they had to do, and they worked as a group to get the task done. The last participant I interviewed, he pretty much indicated that there was some conflict, but 5 people suggested that there was no conflict.
So as far as the activity of the group, it sounds like they have 3 things at least that they've got to do. One is that they're actually dealing with the historical information on the sites, and then another is that they're dealing with this form that they have to fill out for the National Park Service, and then the third one is they're dealing with the technology.
Right.
And so I'm just wondering kind of how that, when they are interacting with each other, how much of that is dealing with the historical content, how much of that's dealing with the wrestling with the form, or dealing with the Park Service form, and then how much of it is kind of dealing with the technology? Or so do they do the historical work kind of as individuals and then just come together to try and deal with the form, or is it a back and forth where the form sends them out to do some historical research? Or?
Well, one of the things about this group is that everyone feels that they know their role within the group, and so they all kind of operate autonomously. And with the technology itself, what we did with 2 members of the group is we had a formal training session where we sat them down, and a couple of the undergraduate students, they trained them how to use this software. Now, the group task now is that they've set up an advisory committee independent of the group to identify the sites that they need to go out and document. And once that happens, the group is going to come together as a group and have sort of like a kickoff meeting. And you have two people that work as volunteers in the local historic society, and basically what they do is serve as a resource. And so the other group members pretty much go to them if they have questions or concerns that they can't find on their own. And since they're at the Historic Society, what they do is research it. Another one of the participants works at Domestic Relations, which is near the courthouse, and also the library. And so on her lunch breaks and her breaks, she's able to go through the archives. And she's pretty much what she defines herself as, a self-trained genealogist. Whereas one member is the consultant, who pretty much serves as the person who pretty much determines whether or not they're going about things the right way and what they should do differently and how they ought to go about doing it. And then, of course, you have the person in Indiana who pretty much is sort of not really attached to the group right now, because there's a couple of people in the group that say they never met her before. So it's...
That's Monica.
Yeah, right. So what we're hoping will happen, and not to say that it necessarily will happen, because two of the members don't even have internet access at home, so the question becomes then, how do they access this tool from home? One version of the software where you enter the web editor, you can do that using dial-up, but that interactive client that I just showed you with that workspace, you pretty much need high-speed access in order to use that client. One thing I'm concerned about with this particular group, I know they're motivated to perform the task. I feel that the primary stakeholder that we've been working with has some sort of, I guess I would say, leverage over the group, because one particular person, James, was slow in responding to me in terms of setting up an interview. And so I gave him 2 weeks, and I went back to the lead participant and I said, well, he didn't respond, so I guess we can go on and proceed with the study without him. And she sent him a long email just flat laying him out and told him that she understood that they had an agreement, and that if something's changed that she didn't understand, if he no longer wants to be involved, just say so, because he doesn't need to be wasting everybody else's time. And she actually sent him that email, and 2 hours later we had an appointment, and I did the interview the next day.
Is he the one that identified there being conflict?
He's the one. He's the one. He's the one. He's the one. Yep.
What is the scope of the online communities that you're studying? I run an open source team group project, so we have these minis, very, very small groups of online participants. So the one takeaway that I took from this was that I'm trying to figure out, how do you measure success for an open source project where you're doing collaborative development at the source code level, especially coming from Microsoft. We're not, exactly known to do that. So I thought the numbers of when I talk to you and you come back and talk to me, like those percentages and the transitive metrics. But I was just wondering if the focus was on where there's not, like the question earlier, where you don't have an infrastructure built, like MySpace. Is this a study for people that are just like, oh, we want to chat, like glorified IM, or just email without an essential infrastructure? Or are you thinking that this could be applied to any type of online community?
I'm thinking it can be applied to any type of online community, but what's different about this project is that we start with the group goals at first, and what the group task is, what the groups are doing, and then look at how technology can be used to support the task. And so you measure it in terms of their productivity in terms of completing the group task, and also the satisfaction with them using the tool to complete that task in order to achieve their goals.
Okay.
Yes, sir.
Well, I'm interested in the fact that you call this a group, and you seem to be avoiding the use of the term team. It's almost as if it's such a disparate group of people that they are not in a position to coalesce into some kind of a team organization. Are you seeing that at all in your research?
3 clicks were found, where you have the first click, which is pretty much what I gathered was Helen, Robert, and Janet are pretty much the group right now. And in terms of the core periphery class members, again, you see Helen, Robert, and Janet, and the rest of them are operating on the periphery. So you have a stable core of 3 members that make up the group with 3 people on the periphery, and one of the hopes that I would have is that using the technology, that it provides a tool to foster this communication and collaboration so that the other people are no longer on the periphery, but they're part of the core group.
Is that something that forced, quote unquote, forced with technology, or is it something that the group itself has to do?
Something the group itself has to do. And like I said, I gave the lead participant a copy of Venger's book on cultivating communities of practice, and it pretty much is designed for practitioners to get a sense of how to go about establishing these particular communities and leading these communities, developing these communities as well.
It's the same exact thing that happened in open source communities, that you have what's called a benevolent dictator, or in this case it would be you have to have a central project leader. And then what will happen is it'll base different parts of the technology. It could be backend, it could be UI, it could be server side, whatever. That core group, like members of that group would be the leads, and then you will have these periphery, like little mini groups forming around that. So you have a core team, and then you start to see these little pockets form around that. So I think it's not so much of as long as the communication is flowing, it's just what people are interested in, and well, at least from the open source part, what people are interested in. But I think this is just something that natural happens. Hey, I'm interested in this, and you're interested in that. And even though we are all interested in the big space, and kind of have these things happen naturally. So I wouldn't say it's actually like a bad thing. It's just interesting that as soon as you brought up the slide, it's like, whoa, there is a correlation between.
Yep, and this one right here looks at reciprocity and detail for each members. And so you see where Helen pretty much has 0.60 symmetric, meaning that she has ties with other people. She'd reach out to these other people, but their non-symmetric is 40% of the people don't go back to Helen. And so it's not reciprocated. And I did this analysis for each one of the individuals.
That's very consistent even with large affinity groups, hobby groups, where you'll have individuals who have a high degree of credibility within the group, and others who are newcomers will try and gain credibility, attach themselves to an individual.
Right.
Same with open source. Work on a small project, build their credibility, get to a bigger project, and try and work their way up the ladder, if you will. And that hierarchy, you mentioned that you've got someone that nobody else knows. I think it was Monica. She's just the newcomer that nobody has attached to yet. She hasn't established her credibility. She hasn't proven herself. Nobody's going to reciprocate or communicate. I mean,
or knows what she has to offer.
Yeah, or cares, because they're trying to do their own thing at the same time.
And because she's isolated out there, her degree centrality was 1.0, whereas her betweenness in terms of acting as a go-between was 0. Yes, sir.
So this is so I think this is very interesting, and this is a comment on future plans after you're through your PhD, which is you said you'd be interested in somewhat larger, looking for larger groups.
Right.
The group that a set of possible sites that I would be extremely interested in seeing this analysis applied to are like conference program committees, conference committees, professional organizations. I've worked in those for like 20 years, and nobody ever does this kind of an analysis to sort of see functional and dysfunctional things happening, and people who may come out, conference happens, but they're not willing to work together again afterwards. I'd be just very interested to see this kind of analysis in that domain, and as a researcher, you could probably get access to some of those.
Yeah, I'm looking for bigger and better things, because it's been a challenge working with groups that, in Wenger's term, are bootleg groups, meaning that they don't have an organizational hierarchy. They don't have an entity that they're actually working for. There's no budget for them. There's no resources. Everything is pretty much, what they can come up with. And the lead participant actually goes out and begs for money just to pay the consultant. Yes.
Yeah, it's really interesting. Part of my job right now is to create an online community. So just to be able to have some metrics to talk to my boss about, yes, this is working, or no, it's not, other than just my feelings about it is incredibly useful. To have something that we can use, that companies can use internally, because so much work is done online, so much work is done worldwide with people that you never meet. To have a set of easy tools would just be invaluable.
Right. One of the things I did, I set up that group effectiveness survey guide to eventually, what I plan to do is have it as an online survey so that participants can go in and they can complete the survey and gather responses that way. And with a larger sample, you can do some quantitative analysis as well.
Okay, well, I think we're approaching the end of our time here, but I'd like to thank Roderick for this presentation.
Thank you.
Anybody have any other